So, the inspiration for today's episode comes from a podcast interview I recently had on a simple therapy podcast, which, if you haven't listened to it, you should, because the host, Sydney, is wonderful. She asks amazing questions and really gets to the heart of things and critically thinks alongside her guest, which is just so refreshing. So, she asked me some really good questions that got me thinking about my own process and the work that we do at the Unbecoming Hub. And I wanted to talk about some of that today, of the inspiration that came from that podcast. And we touched on a lot of different subjects, but the ones that stood out to me the most were the experiences of forgetting and remembering in the context of the process of unbecoming, and shame in the context of the process of unbecoming. And she asked me a lot of different case scenarios of different hypothetical client experiences and how the process of unbecoming would approach those things. And I loved that. It challenged me to think about it differently. And I just love that she was thinking about that. So it was a great podcast. Now, one of them, one of the scenarios really hit home for me, and it's this experience of forgetting and remembering and how that plays into the process of unbecoming. The scenario she used as an example was if someone had struggled with addiction, they became sober, and then they had a relapse and they were in the shame of it all. What would the process of unbecoming, how would it approach that? And a huge part of the process of unbecoming is in this experience that we all have as humans of forgetting and then remembering, and forgetting and then remembering. And what are we forgetting when we forget? And in the process of unbecoming, we're forgetting our inherent wholeness. And what that means is the part of ourselves that we're born with and die with that is complete as it is. It is the essence of who we are and what makes us human. Not personality, not identity, but the essence of being a human. And I describe that sometimes as kind of the tender inside of being human, the part that reaches and feels and needs and senses and experiences. It's all of these amorphous qualities that we can't really wrap our fingers around, but that we all have and experience. The quality of that wholeness, some might call it the soul, animating life force, whatever it might be. It's the essence that makes a human, the aliveness of a person. And in the process of unbecoming, that wholeness holds our vulnerability, our inherent worth and dignity as a human being. And we forget that we're grounded in that is our core. And that forgetting is necessary because we have to externally orient to our environment to adapt. And in order to adapt, we kind of have to separate from that wholeness a little bit, because we learn what brings connection closer and what might push it away. And because we are egocentric in our development, we make that about who we are. And so we start to develop beliefs that we may not be good enough or parts of ourselves aren't wanted. But those were adaptations that were necessary to fit our environment, not truth. But as we move through life, it feels like truth. Those adaptations begin to feel like truth and feel like who we are. And so we're in the forgetting when we're in that place, when we believe those things are true. We're in the forgetting. And when we remember that wholeness is inherent, that's when we start to settle. That's when we can find ground and everything else starts to organize and reorganize with that. And in this scenario where, someone has gone through a relapse and they're in those beliefs, I am damaged, I'm not good enough, there's something wrong with me, why can't I just get this right? They're in the forgetting, they're in the adaptations. So, in the process of unbecoming, we would explore a little bit, how are those adaptations protecting you or helping you right now? And invite a little bit in a confrontational manner, meaning at risk of invalidating the client, that those things aren't actually true. And saying it may feel true, but the reality is that this experience cannot touch the wholeness of who you are. A relapse cannot touch it. Abuse cannot touch it. Bad experiences cannot touch it. That no matter what you go through, that wholeness is always intact. And so there's the validation. It doesn't feel true. It doesn't mean it's not true. And sometimes in therapy world, we can tip a little too far, I think, into validation at all costs. Sometimes I think it's good for the therapist to hold a little bit of a different perspective, one more grounded in what is true, not just what they feel. They meaning the client. And that forgetting and remembering, it's so cyclical because in order to develop, we have to forget. And in some traditions, and this is something Sydney brought into the podcast so beautifully, in some traditions, there's a spiritual component to that we forget in order to remember, and that is the journey of a life, that when we're born, we're most connected to God. I use the word God. You might use a different word. And that then we forget that connection. And in remembering, we are connecting again with something bigger than our human experience can hold, but that is present within all of us. And this process of forgetting and remembering and forgetting and remembering, it's a little bit of an intervention in the process of unbecoming. It's an invitation. So that when you're with someone or with yourself and you notice you're in the forgetting, like, oh yeah, I'm in it again. Well, now you've just remembered. Now you're back in it. Now the invitation's here to step into that, not step into, but to remember the wholeness once again. And she brought up some good questions around shame. If someone's really in the shame, like they truly believe in their core, they are damaged goods. They are defective as a human being. And we see that a lot in the forgetting. I think the most extreme form of forgetting is shame, this really deep shame core. And you see it a lot in experiences of forgetting. It's usually where there's a lot of regret or guilt. And shame is such a great doorway into remembering if we allow it to serve that purpose. Because when we can tolerate the emotion of shame, it holds the gift of humility, common humanity, and a deeper wisdom that we don't get in many other emotions. Maybe pain and grief, is really a lot of wisdom in that, but shame carries it too. The problem is shame is a really uncomfortable sensation and feeling. And so it can get distorted really fast to try to protect from the experience. But that word tolerate, if we can tolerate the experience, and commonly in trauma world or attachment world, you might hear the window of tolerance, what we can tolerate while still being present to the sensations and to the experience. I like to frame this as inherent capacity, which I've talked about on the podcast before. That as humans, we're born with the capacity to hold experience. And just like wholeness, nothing can take that. Nothing can change that. Nothing can take that. It's not a skill you develop. It's not a belief you have to adopt. It is just true. Your capacity to meet experience is already within you. And so when we may experience shame and we tolerate it, that capacity is there to hold the shame. And the how of that is the relationship we may be experiencing with the shame. Because, we can take deep breaths, we can do grounding, we can do all these things that we classically say expand the window of tolerance, is usually the language. But if you hate your shame and you think your shame shouldn't be there and you're in resistance to your shame, you could breathe all day. Your system will have a hard time allowing that shame to be felt in a way that moves it. The capacity is there to meet the shame. It's not that the capacity is not there, but the relationship determines whether or not it moves. And when I say moves, I mean there's space for it to shift. It doesn't stay stuck in the form that you're experiencing it now. And so if we can experience that shame, it's like, oh, I don't want to feel this. I want to figure out a way to make this not about me or make it so far about me that I just spiral into a pit of despair. Shame can go one of two ways. But if we remember, okay, this shame is here to humble me into remembering, it changes immediately. And I have a personal example of this recently. And I've talked a lot on the podcast before about my tendency to move too fast. Man, if there is one thing that gets me caught in the forgetting, it's moving too fast. I just can get really focused on things. I can get really excited about things. And I just want to go, 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 because I'm having so much fun. I don't want to stop. And it actually can cause quite a lot of contraction in my internal world. My thoughts get really narrow. My attention narrows. My thoughts can start to lean a little more negative, even though I like what I'm doing. There can be a little more doubt about what I'm doing. I'm less present with the people around me. I'm more distracted. And so that experience of contraction for me, which I talk about with the forgetting, this narrowing of your experience, happens a lot with my speed and how I'm experiencing my sense of time. And thank goodness for spouses, right? Who aren't afraid to tell you when you're just kind of sucking as a spouse. um, so, my lovely husband helps me remember, and he'll sit me down and say, hey, I think you're doing the thing again. I'm like, yeah, I might be doing the thing again. And of course, there's a part of me that wants to push that away or defend myself or retreat and hide and pull back really far. That used to be my go-to, is just like withdraw completely. Like, oh, I'm never going to do anything I enjoy again. I'm just going to focus on you and everyone else. And, I would overcompensate. Pendulum swing. That's how my shame would react. And, so I felt that hit as soon as he said it to me. And instead, I said, okay, humility is here. And I took it into my awareness, what he said, and I allowed it to push me back into the remembering. Like, oh yeah, I was contracted again. I went into the forgetting. My attention narrowed. I lost access to that wholeness and capacity that's always within me. And shame is the best emotion to take you there. If we can tolerate experiencing it as a humility, as a sense of humanity. Now, that shame is the type of shame where, like, I felt like I had done something wrong. I went outside of my values, and Sydney had asked a great question about someone who maybe has experienced a lot of abuse. It's a very different kind of shame. Like, if I was whole as a person, these bad things wouldn't have happened to me. Or if I really mattered, if I was really worthy, these things wouldn't have happened to me. And the shame for that doorway, or the doorway into that shame that leads into the remembering, that's where the shift in relationship to the shame has to go external. Is there anyone else that you would say that about? And this is where we're using shame to pull on the piece of humanity. Because if someone is treated in a way without humanity, they're less likely to feel their own humanity. So, how do you connect with humanity again when you have been dehumanized? And this is where that remembering, that person thinks about others enough and sees humanity in everybody else. Eventually, it's hard to deny your own humanity. Like, you're the exception. All these billions of people on the planet you can see in humanity, but you're the exception to humanity. If you see someone else who's experienced deep abuse, you see their humanity, someone who's had your exact same circumstances or very close, but you are the one without it. And it's just this relationship over and over and over, the change in the relationship to the experience of shame until it's tolerable through what shame is designed to push us towards. And shame actually has a lot of spiritual roots in that humility and common humanity. If you think about the word shame before it was kind of co-opted into self-help and an emotion that we kind of have resisted over time, shame meant being humble. It wasn't about this yucky emotion as much as it was an expression of a state. And in that, we are able to see humanity in ourselves and others. And that is such a powerful way to remember the inherent wholeness within yourself. So, forgetting and remembering in this cyclical experience that occurs as humans, we do it all the time. We forget, we remember, we forget, we remember. And a lot of self-help world wants to tell you that it's possible to just stay in the remembering. And that if you have forgotten, it means you're off track somehow. There's another stone to turn over, another pattern to examine, another emotion to regulate. So we take the forgetting as evidence that we're doing it wrong and we need to work harder. And there's the pressure and there's the exhaustion. But the forgetting and remembering is part of the human condition. You can't get out of it. It's just here. Because humans we need the contrast of an experience to feel its weight. So if we don't have that, forgetting and remembering, you can't have the remembering without the forgetting. So when you see it as a complete package, not something at odds with each other, but this is a complete experience, forgetting and remembering makes it a complete experience. And it's possible to use the experience of shame as the doorway in. If we can shift the relationship we have to shame, shift the perception, shift the knowledge around why it's there in the first place. And when we change that relationship to shame and we challenge our belief that we're the exception to humanity, or in my case, challenge to experience the shame as a humility that leads me to say, you're right, I'm sorry. And the burn in my chest that accompanies that apology. And that, okay, this doesn't mean I suck as a person. I'm still whole and complete even now. But if we can allow that forgetting and remembering and the doorways into these things that we've been trained to resist, and I use the word train intentionally because the narrative around these experiences is there's so much pressure behind it, so much expectation, so much resistance to the other side of the coin. And you can't have a coin without two sides. So, in the forgetting and the remembering, it's part of the process, an intervention, even an invitation. And maybe that's just the whole point of all of it. You have to leave home to remember what it felt like to be there. And so it takes you back. So maybe this week, if you find yourself in an experience or find yourself in an experience of forgetting, as soon as you notice you're there, now you're remembering. And it doesn't have to be evidence that you're not doing enough. And just see what that shift in perspective does for you. And if you happen to find yourself in an experience of shame, maybe similar to like what I was experiencing with my husband, even if it's in hindsight, but if you remember a different function for shame, change your relationship to the emotion of shame, of what it means, what it's designed to do as humans, because our emotions, they all have a function. They're not without reason. And they're not all bad. So even the discomfort of shame, I actually think is one of the most powerful emotions to bring you into remembering because it's so deep, so challenging. So if you find yourself there and you shift that relationship to shame, even just the perception of what it means, not even anything about you yet, you just see what becomes possible in that inherent capacity to meet it and to let it change you in the way it's designed to do. All right. I think that's it for this one. So there will be a companion essay along with this and a guided reflection about forgetting and remembering. It's a bit of a spoken essay, guided meditation that'll be on Insight Timer. And I will see you next time. You can find more of this work at theunbecominghub.com. Until next time.